The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and straightened his bearskin hat. At 28 years old, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 5 years, standing watch over the royal residence with unwavering dedication. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he took his position at the main gate, his polished boots clicking against the stone with military precision. James came from a family with deep military roots. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands conflict, and now James carried on the tradition with pride. The Queen's Guard wasn't just a job for him. It was a calling that demanded absolute discipline, respect, and honor. Every morning he would remind himself of the oath he had taken and the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. The palace grounds buzzed with their usual activity. Tourists gathered behind the ornate iron gates, cameras clicking constantly as they hoped to catch a glimpse of the stoic guards. James had grown accustomed to the attention, the whispered comments, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or break his composure. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the legendary discipline for which the Queen's Guard was famous worldwide. As the clock tower chimed 9 in the morning, a black diplomatic vehicle pulled up to the embassy district nearby. Ambassador Viktor Petrov stepped out, his expensive suit immaculately pressed and his bearing radiating authority. The 50-year-old diplomat had recently been appointed as his country's representative to the United Kingdom, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference and respect. Petrov had built his career on commanding attention and ensuring that others recognized his status. In his home country, government officials were treated with almost reverent respect, and he expected nothing less during his posting in London. His previous assignments in smaller nations had reinforced his belief that diplomatic immunity and rank should open every door and command every courtesy. The ambassador's morning routine included a walk through the government district, partly for exercise but mostly to establish his presence in the area. He believed in making himself known to all the various security personnel, guards, and officials who worked in the vicinity. Today's route would take him past Buckingham Palace, where he planned to observe the famous changing of the guard ceremony that tourists found so fascinating. As Petrov approached the palace gates, he noticed the rigid figure of Guardsman Mitchell standing at attention. The ambassador's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the young soldier's impeccable uniform and unwavering stance. In Petrov's mind, this presented an opportunity to demonstrate his diplomatic status and perhaps teach these British guards about proper respect for foreign dignitaries. The ambassador slowed his pace, his polished leather shoes tapping deliberately against the pavement as he approached the gate. He had dealt with various military personnel throughout his career, and he believed that a show of authority early on would establish the proper dynamic for future encounters. The morning was about to take an unexpected turn that would be remembered in diplomatic circles for years to come. James remained perfectly still, his training taking over as he sensed someone approaching with purposeful intent. He had learned to read body language and recognize different types of visitors to the palace grounds. This man's approach seemed different from the typical tourist or casual observer. There was something in his bearing that suggested he expected special treatment, and James prepared himself for whatever interaction might follow. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the boundaries of diplomatic protocol, military tradition, and personal dignity. Neither man could have anticipated how this seemingly simple encounter would escalate, or how the Guardian's response would send shockwaves through the embassy and beyond. The morning air seemed to grow tenser as the two men found themselves on a collision course that would define their mutual respect, or lack thereof, for each other's positions and responsibilities. Ambassador Petrov came to a halt directly in front of Guardsman Mitchell, positioning himself barely 3 feet away from the motionless soldier. The ambassador's chest puffed out slightly as he assumed what he considered his most authoritative posture. His years of diplomatic experience had taught him that first impressions were crucial, and he intended to make his status unmistakably clear to this British guard. "Good morning, soldier," Petrov announced in accented English, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate attention and response. "I am Ambassador Viktor Petrov, diplomatic representative of my nation to your country. I believe proper protocol requires that you acknowledge my presence with appropriate military courtesy." James felt every muscle in his body tense, though his exterior remained as still as a statue. His training had prepared him for many unusual situations, but diplomatic confrontations were typically handled by his superior officers. The Queen's Guard protocols were crystal clear about maintaining position and composure, regardless of who approached or what they demanded. He continued staring straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. The ambassador waited for several long seconds, expecting some form of acknowledgement or salute. When none came, his eyebrows furrowed and his jaw tightened noticeably. In every other country where he had served, local military personnel had shown immediate deference to his diplomatic status. This apparent disrespect was both puzzling and irritating. "I said good morning," Petrov repeated, his voice rising slightly in volume and taking on a sharper edge. "Are you deaf, young man? I am a foreign ambassador, and diplomatic courtesy demands that you show proper respect. I require a salute immediately." The demand hung in the air like a challenge. Several tourists nearby had begun to notice the exchange, their cameras and phones turning toward the unfolding drama. The morning had been peaceful until this moment, but now tension crackled between the two men like electricity before a thunderstorm. James could feel sweat beginning to form under his bearskin hat, but his face remained impassive. His 5 years of service had taught him that the Queen's Guard never broke protocol, regardless of pressure, threats, or demands. The tourists, the media, and even foreign dignitaries could not make him abandon his duty or compromise his position. His loyalty belonged to the crown, and his orders came through the proper military chain of command. The ambassador took a step closer, his frustration growing more evident with each passing second. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he declared, his voice now loud enough to attract attention from other guards positioned around the palace perimeter. "I am invoking my diplomatic status and demanding that you salute me immediately. Your failure to do so constitutes a serious breach of international diplomatic protocol." Behind the gates, other guards had begun to take notice of the situation. Sergeant William Davies, a 20-year veteran of the Queen's Guard, observed the confrontation with growing concern. He knew that situations like this required careful handling to avoid international incidents, but he also understood that his men were never to break their ceremonial positions without explicit orders from superior officers. Petrov reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his diplomatic credentials, waving them in front of Mitchell's face. "These papers grant me immunity and special status in your country," he announced loudly. "Your government recognizes my authority, and I demand the respect that comes with my position. Salute me now, or I will report this incident to your Foreign Office and my own embassy." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with tourists whispering excitedly among themselves and some beginning to record the increasingly heated exchange. Social media posts were already beginning to appear, with hashtags about diplomatic incidents and British guards trending in real time. The modern world's instant communication meant that this confrontation would soon have an audience far beyond the palace gates. James could hear the ambassador's words clearly, but his training overrode any impulse to respond. The Queen's Guard stood as symbols of British tradition, discipline, and unwavering duty. No amount of pressure, diplomatic or otherwise, could make him abandon his post or break the protocols that had governed his service for centuries. His silence spoke louder than any words could have, and his stillness demonstrated the strength of his convictions. The ambassador's face began to redden with anger and embarrassment. In his home country, such defiance from a common soldier would have resulted in immediate disciplinary action. The growing crowd of witnesses only intensified his humiliation, and he realized that his authority was being publicly challenged in a way he had never experienced before. The morning sun seemed to grow hotter as the confrontation reached its boiling point. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, with neither man willing to yield. Ambassador Petrov's face had progressed from red to deep crimson, and beads of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His diplomatic training had never prepared him for such blatant disregard of his authority, especially in front of an increasingly large audience of tourists and media representatives. "This is your final warning, soldier," Petrov declared through clenched teeth, his accented English becoming more pronounced as his anger intensified. "I am ordering you to salute me immediately. Your continued defiance is creating a diplomatic incident that will have serious consequences for both of our nations." Do you understand the gravity of what you are doing? James remained as motionless as the bronze statues that adorned the palace grounds. His breathing stayed measured and controlled, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the ambassador's shoulder. Every fiber of his being wanted to explain the situation, to clarify the protocols that governed his behavior. But his duty demanded silence. The Queen's Guard did not engage in debates or negotiations while on ceremonial duty. From his position near the main gate, Sergeant Davies had been monitoring the situation with growing unease. He recognized the potential for this confrontation to escalate beyond simple diplomatic embarrassment into a full-blown international incident. However, military protocol required that he not intervene unless there was a direct threat to security or unless explicitly ordered by his commanding officers. The crowd of onlookers had swelled to over 50 people, with tour guides struggling to maintain their group's attention while secretly delighting in the unexpected drama. Cell phone cameras captured every moment, and live streams were broadcasting the confrontation to viewers around the world. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation about the identity of the angry man confronting the stoic guard. Petrov pulled out his mobile phone and began dialing a number, his movements sharp and agitated. "I am calling my embassy immediately," he announced loudly, clearly intending for both the guard and the surrounding crowd to hear. "This incident will be reported to the highest levels of both governments. Your insubordination will have consequences that reach far beyond this palace gate." As the ambassador spoke rapidly in his native language to someone on the other end of the line, James could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He understood that his actions or lack thereof were being scrutinized by potentially thousands of people, yet his training had prepared him for exactly this type of pressure, and he drew strength from the knowledge that he was upholding traditions that stretched back centuries. The phone conversation lasted several minutes, during which Petrov gestured wildly and his voice rose and fell in obvious agitation. When he finally ended the call, his expression had shifted from anger to something approaching satisfaction. He clearly believed that he had set in motion events that would vindicate his position and punish the disrespectful guard. "My embassy is sending senior staff immediately," Petrov announced with renewed confidence. "They will be accompanied by officials from your foreign office who will explain to you the serious nature of diplomatic immunity and the respect owed to foreign representatives. Your military superiors will also be contacted to address your shameful behavior." Despite the ambassador's threats, James felt a strange sense of calm descending over him. He had been trained for situations that tested his resolve, and this was simply another challenge to overcome. The Queen's Guard had faced down enemies in battle, weathered storms and extreme temperatures, and maintained their posts through countless crises. One angry diplomat, regardless of his status or threats, could not shake the foundation of his duty. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard. The changing light seemed to highlight the contrast between the two men, the agitated diplomat in his expensive suit, pacing and gesticulating, and the perfectly still guardian in his traditional red tunic, embodying the calm strength of British military tradition. Tourist guides had begun incorporating the drama into their presentations, explaining to their groups about the famous discipline of the Queen's Guard and the protocols that governed their behavior. Some visitors expressed sympathy for the ambassador, while others admired the soldier's unwavering commitment to duty. The incident was rapidly becoming a real-time case study in cultural differences and military tradition. As the ambassador continued his tirade, other guards around the palace remained at their posts, each one watching the situation while maintaining their own ceremonial positions. They understood that their colleague was being tested, and they stood ready to support him through their own continued adherence to protocol and tradition. The brotherhood of the Queen's Guard meant that no man stood alone, even when facing the full fury of diplomatic indignation. 20 minutes after Ambassador Petrov's heated phone call, a black diplomatic vehicle pulled up to the palace gates with unusual urgency. Deputy Ambassador Elena Volkova stepped out, her expression grave and her movements efficient. She had been hastily summoned from an important trade negotiation meeting to deal with what her superior had described as an unprecedented diplomatic crisis involving British military personnel. Volkova was known throughout diplomatic circles as a skilled negotiator and problem solver. Unlike her superior, She had spent years studying British culture, military traditions, and governmental protocols. Her approach to diplomacy emphasized understanding and respect, rather than demands and confrontation. As she surveyed the scene, she immediately recognized that the situation was far more complex than Petrov had described. The deputy ambassador approached her superior with careful steps, noting the large crowd of onlookers, the multiple cameras recording the incident, and the perfectly composed British guard who remained motionless at his post. Her experienced eye quickly assessed that this was not a case of military insubordination, but rather a misunderstanding of protocol and tradition. "Victor," she said quietly in their native language, "please step aside with me so we can discuss this situation privately." Her tone was respectful but carried an undertone of urgency that suggested she understood the gravity of the moment better than he did. "Ambassador." Petrov's face showed surprise at his deputy's calm demeanor. He had expected her to arrive with the same outrage he felt, and to immediately demand satisfaction from the British authorities. Instead, she seemed more interested in de-escalating the situation than in supporting his position. "Elena, this soldier has shown complete disrespect for our diplomatic status," Petrov declared loudly, clearly intending for the crowd to hear his grievances. "He has ignored direct orders to salute and has created an international incident through his insubordination. I have demanded that the British government take immediate action." Volkova nodded diplomatically while quietly observing Guardsman Mitchell's impeccable posture and obvious dedication to duty. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between disrespect and adherence to protocol. The young soldier's bearing suggested discipline rather than defiance, tradition rather than rebellion. "I understand your concerns," she replied carefully, "but perhaps we should consider that there may be established protocols governing the behavior of ceremonial guards that we are not fully aware of. The British military has very specific traditions regarding when and how their personnel may break their ceremonial positions." The ambassador's eyebrows furrowed as he processed his deputy's words. The suggestion that he might not understand the situation fully was clearly unwelcome. But Volkova's reputation for diplomatic success gave her words weight that could not be easily dismissed. Meanwhile, a second vehicle had arrived containing officials from the British Foreign Office. Senior Protocol Officer Margaret Henderson stepped out with the practiced calm of someone who had handled numerous diplomatic misunderstandings throughout her 30-year career. She immediately recognized the situation as a case of cultural miscommunication rather than intentional disrespect. Henderson approached the two diplomats with a warm but professional smile. "Good morning, Ambassador Petrov, Deputy Ambassador Volkova. I understand there has been some confusion regarding military protocol. I am here to help clarify the situation and ensure that all parties understand the traditions and regulations that govern our ceremonial guards." Her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Rather than continuing to escalate tensions, the focus began shifting toward education and understanding. The British officials' calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the heated emotions that had dominated the morning's events. "Mrs. Henderson," Petrov began, his voice still carrying traces of his earlier anger, "your soldier has refused to show proper diplomatic courtesy, despite my clear identification as a foreign ambassador. This behavior is unacceptable and demands immediate corrective action." Henderson nodded sympathetically while maintaining her diplomatic composure. "I completely understand your expectations, Ambassador, and I want to assure you that the behavior you observed was not intended as disrespect. The Queen's Guard operates under very specific ceremonial protocols that have been maintained for centuries. These brave soldiers are trained to maintain their positions regardless of external circumstances, and they cannot break those positions without direct orders from their commanding officers." The explanation seemed to give Volkova visible relief, as it confirmed her initial assessment of the situation. She had suspected that cultural misunderstanding rather than intentional slight had created the confrontation, and Henderson's words provided the context needed to resolve the crisis. James continued to maintain his position throughout the diplomatic discussions, though he could feel the tension in the air beginning to ease. The arrival of official representatives from both governments suggested that the situation was being handled at the appropriate level, and he trusted that his superiors would ensure that protocol was properly explained and respected. The crowd of tourists and media representatives remained captivated by the unfolding drama. Though the tone had shifted from confrontation to negotiation, many observers began to understand that they were witnessing not just a diplomatic incident, but a real-time lesson in how cultural differences could be resolved through patient explanation and mutual respect. Margaret Henderson gestured toward a quieter area near the palace gates, where the diplomatic discussion could continue with more privacy. As the group moved away from the immediate vicinity of Guardsman Mitchell, the protocol officer began to provide a detailed explanation of the traditions that governed the Queen's Guard. The ceremonial guards you see here represent one of Britain's oldest and most respected military traditions, Henderson explained patiently. These soldiers are serving members of active infantry regiments who have earned the honor of protecting royal residences through their exceptional service and dedication. When they assume their ceremonial positions, they are bound by protocols that have remained unchanged for centuries. Deputy Ambassador Volkova listened intently, occasionally translating key points for her superior, who was beginning to show signs of understanding despite his continued frustration. The protocol officer's respectful tone and comprehensive explanation were helping to transform what had been a confrontational situation into an educational opportunity. The guards cannot acknowledge individual visitors, respond to questions, or break their positions for any reason other than security threats or direct orders from their commanding officers, Henderson continued. This includes interactions with foreign dignitaries, government officials, and even members of the royal family when they are performing their ceremonial duties. Ambassador Petrov's expression gradually shifted from anger to something approaching embarrassment as the full implications of the explanation became clear. His diplomatic training had prepared him for many cultural differences, but he had not anticipated that military tradition could override normal diplomatic courtesies in such an absolute manner. But surely, Petrov interjected, there must be some recognition of diplomatic immunity and the special status accorded to foreign representatives. In my country, military personnel always acknowledge the presence of government officials and foreign dignitaries. Henderson nodded understandingly. I appreciate that different nations have varying protocols, Ambassador. However, the Queen's Guard serves a unique function that combines active military duty with ceremonial tradition. Their primary responsibility is to embody the continuity and stability of British institutions through their unwavering dedication to protocol. As this conversation continued, Colonel James Whitfield, commanding officer of the Guard Regiment, arrived at the scene. His presence immediately commanded respect from all parties, including the diplomatic representatives. The colonel's distinguished bearing and numerous military decorations spoke to decades of exemplary service. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Whitfield addressed the group with the authority that came from his rank and experience. I understand there has been some confusion regarding our ceremonial protocols. I am here to ensure that all parties have a complete understanding of the situation and to address any concerns you may have. The colonel's arrival marked a turning point in the morning's events. His calm professionalism and obvious military expertise provided the credibility needed to definitively resolve the misunderstanding. Even Ambassador Petrov seemed to recognize that he was now dealing with the appropriate level of military authority. Colonel, Petrov began more respectfully, I am Ambassador Petrov, and I was seeking proper diplomatic recognition from your guardsmen. I was not aware that your ceremonial protocols prevented normal military courtesies. Colonel Whitfield smiled slightly, appreciating the ambassador's more measured tone. I understand completely, Ambassador. These protocols can seem unusual to those unfamiliar with our traditions. However, I want to assure you that the behavior you observed represents the highest form of military discipline and respect, not disregard for your diplomatic status. The colonel then turned toward Guardsman Mitchell, who remained perfectly at attention throughout the ongoing discussions. Guardsman Mitchell has served with distinction for 5 years and has never failed to maintain the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. His conduct this morning exemplifies exactly the type of dedication and protocol adherence that makes this unit internationally respected. Volkova seized the opportunity to help her superior understand the cultural context more fully. Ambassador, she said quietly in their native language, it appears that we have witnessed something quite remarkable. This soldier's refusal to break protocol even under pressure demonstrates the same type of unwavering loyalty that makes military traditions meaningful. The diplomatic group spent several more minutes discussing the historical background of the Queen's Guard, the rigorous selection process for ceremonial duties, and the specific protocols that governed interactions with the public. Henderson and Colonel Whitfield provided detailed answers to all questions, ensuring that both diplomats left with a complete understanding of British military traditions. As the formal discussion concluded, Ambassador Petrov found himself in the unexpected position of needing to reassess his initial reaction to the morning's events. The comprehensive explanations had revealed that what he interpreted as disrespect was actually the highest form of military professionalism and traditional discipline. The crowd of tourists and media representatives had remained throughout the extended diplomatic discussion, many of them learning alongside the ambassador about the deeper significance of the Queen's Guard protocols. The incident had evolved from a potential international crisis into an impromptu cultural exchange that benefited everyone involved. The transformation in Ambassador Petrov's demeanor was remarkable to witness. As the full weight of his misunderstanding became apparent, his earlier anger gave way to something approaching admiration for the young guardsman who had maintained his position with such unwavering dedication. The ambassador realized that he had inadvertently witnessed one of the finest examples of military discipline and traditional values that existed anywhere in the world. "Colonel Whitfield," Petrov said with newfound respect in his voice, "I must apologize for my earlier reaction. I now understand that your guardsman was demonstrating the highest form of military professionalism, not showing disrespect for my diplomatic position. In fact, his dedication to duty is quite admirable." The colonel accepted the apology graciously, understanding that cultural misunderstandings were inevitable when different traditions intersected. "Your reaction was completely understandable, Ambassador. We appreciate your willingness to learn about our customs, and we hope this experience has been educational rather than merely frustrating." Deputy Ambassador Volkova stepped forward with a suggestion that would help transform this incident into something positive for both nations. Perhaps this situation could serve as an opportunity for greater cultural exchange between our countries. We would be honored to invite Colonel Whitfield and some of his guards to visit our embassy for a presentation about British military traditions. The suggestion was met with enthusiasm from all parties. Margaret Henderson recognized the diplomatic value of such an exchange, while Colonel Whitfield saw an opportunity to share the pride and heritage of the Queen's Guard with international visitors. What had begun as a confrontation was evolving into a foundation for improved understanding and cooperation. As the diplomatic discussion concluded, Ambassador Petrov did something that surprised everyone present. He walked slowly back to where Guardsman Mitchell continued to stand at perfect attention, his posture unchanged despite the hour-long drama that had unfolded around him. The ambassador positioned himself directly in front of the young soldier, but this time his bearing was entirely different. "Guardsman," Petrov said quietly, though his words were clearly audible to the nearby crowd, "I want you to know that I now understand the honor and tradition you represent. Your dedication to duty, even under pressure, reflects the best qualities of military service. I respect your commitment to your protocols and your refusal to compromise your standards." The ambassador then executed a respectful bow toward the motionless guard, a gesture that drew spontaneous applause from the assembled tourists and media representatives. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would soon become viral content on social media platforms around the world. James felt a surge of pride at the ambassador's words and gesture, though his training prevented him from showing any external response. The morning's trial had tested his resolve in ways he had never anticipated, but he had remained true to the traditions and protocols that defined his service. The public vindication of his actions was deeply satisfying, even if he could not openly acknowledge it. Colonel Whitfield approached the ambassador with a warm smile. "Your gesture of respect means more than you know, Ambassador. These young men and women dedicate their lives to upholding traditions that connect us to centuries of military heritage. Your understanding and appreciation of their sacrifice is deeply valued." The incident concluded with handshakes, exchanges of contact information, and promises of future cultural cooperation. Margaret Henderson ensured that both embassies received comprehensive briefings about British ceremonial protocols to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The British Foreign Office would use this incident as a case study for improving cultural orientation programs for newly arrived diplomats. As the diplomatic vehicles departed and the crowd of onlookers gradually dispersed, Guardsman Mitchell continued his ceremonial duty as if nothing unusual had occurred. His perfect posture and unwavering gaze served as a reminder that the Queen's Guard would continue to uphold their traditions, regardless of the challenges they faced. The story of the confrontation between Ambassador Petrov and Guardsman Mitchell spread rapidly through both traditional and social media channels. It became a powerful example of how cultural misunderstandings could be resolved through patience, education, and mutual respect. Military academies around the world would later use this incident to illustrate the importance of maintaining protocol under pressure. Years later, Ambassador Petrov would often tell the story of his encounter with the British Guardsman as a lesson in the importance of understanding local customs and military traditions. He developed a deep appreciation for the Queen's Guard and became one of their most vocal international supporters. The incident that began with anger and misunderstanding ultimately strengthened diplomatic relations and created lasting friendships between two very different cultures. The morning sun had climbed high in the sky by the time normalcy returned to the palace gates, but the impact of those crucial hours would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. Guardsman Mitchell's silent reply to the ambassador's demands had indeed stunned the embassy, but not in the way anyone had initially expected. His unwavering commitment to duty had transformed a potential diplomatic crisis into a celebration of military tradition and international understanding.